Okay, so we finished up the study on the centurions from the New Testament last Wednesday. So now we're moving on to our study on Sarah, or Sarai as she was known formerly, mainly in the book of Genesis. So as I mentioned, the notes are on the back table if you didn't get the notes on this. Sarah is actually, it's really interesting study because obviously anytime you start studying Sarah, there's going to be aspects of Abraham and some of the other patriarchs as well, and so there's a lot that we could look into. We're not going to open up the whole thing into all of it, but we are going to cover some of it as I'll show in just a minute. So starting in chapter 11 of Genesis and in verse 24, we find a man named Nahor, that is Moses' grandfather. He lived 29 years. He begot Terah. Terah is the father of Abraham, or Abram, as he was. I'm sorry, Abram's grandfather. Sorry. If I say Moses, y'all correct me because I've been doing that in my mind all day. Moses and Abram. So Abram's grandfather is Nahor. His father is Terah. He lived 119 years. He begot sons and daughters, and Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So he was 70 years old when he started having kids, apparently, or at least with this particular wife that he has. We see that there are three main children that come from Terah: Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now, these three are going to end up comprising the origins of the entire patriarchal family that we know regarding the Abrahamic line. Starting in verse 27, this is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begot Lot. Haran died before his father Terah in his native land of Ur in the Chaldeans. Then Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. But Sarah was barren. She had no child. And then we see how that Terah took all of them, his whole family, including Lot. They leave and go to the land of Canaan, and that's where Terah died. He was 205 years old when he died in Haran. So, this is the origin. This is the beginning. And it's important to note this, as we'll see in just a moment, because of the entire genealogy of Abraham. Now, I'm going to zoom in a little bit on this. So we've got Terah. We've got Terah up here. Okay, it's cutting off some of it. That's weird. Why is it doing that? Anyway, all right, there we go. We got Terah. There you go. Excuse me. We got Terah. This is Abraham's father. We got Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Now you'll notice all three of these being the sons of Terah, this is Abraham's line coming down here. Here's Nahor's line. He ends up producing Laban. Laban is famous for what? Yeah, he's the one who tricked Jacob when it came to Rachel and Leah. He worked for 7 years for Rachel, and he tricked him, gave him Leah instead. He came back, well, you're going to have to work 7 more years, so he worked 14 years for Rachel ultimately. But Laban, and then you have, of course, from Jacob, you've got Leah, Zilpah, Bilhah, and Rachel, all of whom make up or gave birth to the 12 tribes. A lot of times we just think about Leah and Rachel, but Zilpah was Leah's handmaiden and Bilhah was Rachel's handmaiden, and Jacob had children with all 4 women, and so all 12 tribes came from those 4 women. But notice the crossing from Abraham and Haran. Okay, Nahor there's Laban from Nahor as well, but you've got Lot over here, you've got Milcah, you've got Iscah. Of course, we remember the story or the account of Lot and how that his daughters got Lot drunk, and from that came the Moabites and the Ammonites, which ended up being thorns in the side of Israel for a long time. But it's interesting because you've got that cross connection of the family, ultimately cousins, basically. Now, in the time of the patriarchs, this was common. Okay, this was commonplace. Today, it's taboo and so forth. But in that time, it was commonplace. Sarah, on the other hand, despite the fact that Sarah is often commonly connected to being Iscah, it's kind of an interesting backstory with Iscah. The rabbinic, or the Jewish tradition, says that Sarai is the same as Iscah. Iscah, however, was not the half-sister of Abraham. She would have been the cousin of Abraham. Iscah, the name itself, means to see in Hebrew. And because the Jews traditionally think of Iscah as being Sarah, they associate prophetic abilities with Sarah. And so they're taught that Sarah was a prophetess. And as a result, there's a whole backstory involving Iscah/Sarah being a prophetess and the things she prophesied and how her relationship with Abraham, because of her abilities to prophesy, caused problems between the two and all kinds of stuff. It's interesting, but none of it's according to Scripture. Because what we're told in between Genesis 12 and Genesis chapter 20 is that how was Sarah related to Abraham? His half-sister. In fact, Abraham makes it clear to Abimelech in Genesis chapter 20 that when he explains their relationship, I didn't lie, she is my sister, she's the daughter of my father, but has a different mother. And so they were half siblings. And again, that seems gross to us today, but in the patriarchal times, that was commonplace. But I thought this was a really interesting chart. Just kind of makes it easy to see how all of the patriarchs, who all cross-married and who all came from whom. Oh yeah, and Rebecca and Laban, you see they came from Bethuel. Isaac married Rebecca, so there's cross-connection there. Jacob with Leah and Rachel. So I mean, you've got cross connections all over the place. Any thoughts through that particular point about the immediate genealogy there? All right, as we know, she was the half-sister of Abraham, same father but different mother. That is supposed to be Genesis 20, verse 12. Genesis 12, there's two different times where Abraham, or Abram, it's Abram in Genesis 12, he's Abraham by Genesis 20, where he tells Sarah to say, "You're my sister." One is with Pharaoh in Genesis chapter 12. The second time is after she's had Isaac, and they have gone into the land of King Abimelech, and he tells Abimelech the same thing, that she's my sister, and she agrees, yes, I'm his sister. But Genesis 20 and verse 12 is where Abraham specifically references the fact that she is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. So as I mentioned, this type of relationship was common at that time. However, in Leviticus chapter 18 and in verse 9, we find that under the Mosaical law, this type of relationship would be outlawed. They were not to intermarry and have relationships with siblings of either parent, whether they were full siblings, half siblings, or otherwise. And there are limitations placed on relationships between immediate family members in Leviticus chapter 18. So that's noteworthy. Again, in the time of the patriarchs, it was commonplace. In fact, in some cases, it was necessary just because of the population issue. But by the time of the law of Moses, God says no more of that. Any thoughts through that? Now, Sarah was apparently very, very, very beautiful. In fact, unless all of the women at the time were just kind of very homely, and she was just kind of regular looking, but by contrast she was beautiful. Either that or she was strikingly beautiful, because we'll note that both Pharaoh, who could have had his choice of women, and King Abimelech, who also could have had his choice of women, as soon as they enter the country, both Pharaoh and King Abimelech, they want Sarah. And that's why Abraham was so concerned about being killed so that they would acquire Sarah. That's why he had her say that, "You're my sister." That I'm the brother of Abraham, we're not married, so that they wouldn't kill Abraham. And we see that again in Genesis 12 and in Genesis chapter 20, both times where Pharaoh and King Abimelech, these men of power, and certainly they could have any woman they wanted, As soon as Sarah comes into view, they want her. So apparently she was strikingly beautiful. Again, either that or just by contrast, she was so much prettier than everybody else. We know she was barren in chapter 11 and in verse 30. She never had children until Isaac. Of course, that was a son of promise. But even before that, she was barren. Her name in both forms, both Sarai and Sarah, means princess. Okay, both forms. In fact, if you ever Google Sarai versus Sarah, you're going to get basically the same answer. Nobody knows why God changed the name of Sarai to Sarah. Remember, he changed Abram to Abraham in Genesis 17 when he established his covenant with Abraham and gave the promise of a child, gave the promises, and so forth, and circumcision. Well, he also, at the same time, changed Sarah's name. Not to a different meaning, but to a different spelling. Now, the only legitimate thing that I could find had to do with the Hebrew spelling of Sarai and Sarah. And again, it's not conclusive that this is why, but Sarah, ultimately, the way Sarah is spelled in Hebrew versus Sarai, apparently it has connections to how Israel would be spelled in Hebrew. Whether or not God did that on purpose to show connection from Israel all the way back to Abraham and Sarah, I don't know. But I thought that was very interesting from Hebrew scholarship that was one possibility that was brought up, given that they both had the same meaning, that maybe it was the difference in spelling. And when they started looking at the difference in spelling, Israel had a relationship to Sarah in its spelling. So I just kind of thought that was interesting. Anything through that? All right. We know in Genesis chapter 17, after God promises Abraham a son, that Abraham was 100 years old when the promise came to him. How old was Sarah? She was 90. Okay, she was 90, which means she's 10 years younger than Abraham. We know in chapter 17 and in verse 17, when Abraham says she's 90 years old, how's she going to have a child? She's 90 years old, so she's still around 90, maybe 91, depending on how long 9 months took place in terms of her birthday, when she had Isaac. So then, in Genesis chapter 23 and verse 1, we find that she lives until she's 127 years old. So, according to chapter 24 and verse 67, after Isaac goes down, he finds Rebekah, he marries her, we're told in verse 67, he takes her to his mother's tent, and she becomes his wife. So, assuming that takes place, in fact, the scripture bears out that Isaac was comforted by Rebekah after the death of his mother. So, assuming that took place within that same year, how old would Isaac have been when he got married? 37. He would have been 37 years old. Sarah was 90. She died at 127. 127 from 90 is 37. So he would have been 37 years old when he married Rebekah. She was buried in a cave in Hebron in Genesis chapter 23, verse 19. In fact, there's quite a bit of detail there as to the lengths that Abraham went to acquire this cave and this field in which the cave dwelt or existed. And he bought it in the hearing of all the people of the city, so that from his generation on, every generation knew that that's Abraham's cave. He buried Sarah there. He was buried there, and ultimately, according to Genesis 49, verse 31, all the patriarchs ended up being buried there. Isaac, Rebekah, and so forth. Even all the way down to Jacob as well. So, that became the burial place of the patriarchs. People, they know where it is. I don't know that they've actually found the actual graves or burial places of any of the patriarchs, obviously, but they have a general idea of where this place is. Thoughts or comments through that? All right. As I mentioned with the secular history, talking about Sarah and Iscah, It's interesting when I started going down the rabbit hole of Iska, and it is a rabbit hole. If you Google Iska and its associated renderings and so forth, it's a rabbit hole. You'll find all kinds of stuff. But apparently, Iska, I just thought this was interesting, is considered the name that was the original source for the name Jessica that was first used by Shakespeare. Shakespeare was the first one to use the female name Jessica the way we know it. And the reason for that is because in the Bibles that Shakespeare had in his time, Iska was translated Jeska, Jeska. And from that, he anglicized it and made it Jessica, and thus we have Jessica today. I just thought that was really, really interesting. It has nothing to do with Sarah, but I just thought that was funny. All right. So let's move on to talking about her character. So talking about Sarah and her character, we find in Genesis chapter 16, really those first 6 verses is the situation with Sarah and Hagar. Now, what's interesting about this is for the longest time, I had always said, especially in association with the application of trying to help God's plan along, that situations like what we have with Rebecca and Sarah, it's as if they're trying to help God along in his plan. But notice that chapter 16, what happens? Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarah said to Abram, "See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her." And Abram heeded the voice of Sarah. And Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. So this is ultimately the union that would produce Ishmael. Okay, and of course Ishmael has his whole line and story and everything else. But what was the reasoning for Sarah to give Hagar to Abraham? Okay, to bear children. Why? Because she couldn't have any. And it had nothing to do with the promise of God, because when will the promise of God come? In chapter 17. See, the promise has not yet been given. Sarah has no idea that there is a promise of a son. And so in her effort to simply have children, and of course, and this was common in this time, giving the handmaiden, just as we see with others of the patriarchal line, they bear children with others as well. But Sarah's effort here was to be able to bear children for Abraham, to have a lineage, a legacy. And of course, remember, children in that time were very, very important because of the genealogies. And so this was her thought process. The promise doesn't come until chapter 17. And when we do the math between the birth of Ishmael to the birth of Isaac, it's 14 years. 14 years between chapter 16 and chapter 17, or at least the birth of Isaac. So you've got 14 years that pass between chapter 16 and the end of chapter 17, which I think is just very interesting. So in verse 4, he went to Hagar, she conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes, basically. And the kind of the thought process here is that I'm now more important than she is. I've borne children to Abraham, therefore I'm more of a wife to him than his wife is. It's not necessarily hostility, although it can be interpreted that way. At the very least, it was, I'm a better wife than you are, is the thought. So in verse 5, Sarah said to Abram, "My wrong be upon you. I gave my maid into your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between you and me." So Abram said to Sarah, "Indeed, your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please." And when Sarai dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence. Chapter 7, on through the rest, deals with basically God's dialogue with Hagar, the promise that this child will become a great nation and so forth, and Ishmael, and he told her to go back to Sarah, and she does. In fact, she doesn't leave again until sometime later. So, after Isaac is born. So as a result, we see her dealing harshly with Hagar because of the fact that she bore a child, and that kind of changed the dynamic between the three of them, or at least in Sarah's eyes, and apparently maybe in Hagar's eyes. Whether it changed the dynamic to Abram, it doesn't say that it did, but at least as far as Sarah, and I'm using them interchangeably at this time, again, until chapter 17, they're Abram and Sarai, then it's Abraham and Sarah. But at least at this point, Sarah and Hagar didn't get along because of the child situation. Thoughts or comments here?
So in chapter 12, when he laid out his promises about you'll be a great nation, it wasn't maybe specifically about Isaac, but do we think that she didn't know about that, or she did?
I don't know that Abraham knew about it, or at least believed it, or fully understood it. Because what we're going to find in chapter 17, what happened when God told him about the promise of a child?
Well, he said, how is that going to...
He laughed. A lot of times, we think of Sarah laughing, and Sarah did laugh, but Abraham laughed first. Okay, so to me that says that Abraham didn't quite fully, yeah, I understand you're going to make me a great nation from chapter 12 regarding that broad promise, but again, whether it was through Ishmael or whatever, maybe that's how he was associating it, not with regard to his own child. Sarah, whether Abram even told Sarah about the dialogue in chapter 12, or even suggested that we're going to have a child or anything like that, again, based on how Abraham reacts in chapter 17, I don't think he thought he was going to have a child. Either that or it had to be through someone else. So as of chapter 16, there's no reason to think that Sarah was trying to do this to help God's promise along. It was all because my husband doesn't have any children. And this is important. This is something that is a necessity. He needs to have kids. So let me give him my handmaid.
Seems like that's something Sarah should know.
Yeah, you would think. Yeah.
I'm the father of many nations.
Yeah, or I'm supposed to be. Yeah.
I have a nation, all nations are going to come through me.
Yeah. Of course, again, a lot of that stuff was said to Abram, but the actual specific promises don't come till chapter 17. So that may have been something he just didn't discuss. Okay, God gave me a promise, but it's a long way off, and there's nothing specific yet coming and so forth, so maybe he just didn't say anything.
And communication could have been different back then.
Communication could have been very different. Yep, between husbands and wives. I'm not going to touch that one. All right, so, okay. All right, so then we move to chapter 20. Yeah, chapter 21. So go to chapter 21. We fast forward to the point where now Isaac is a young child, and Ishmael is now at least 14 years old or older. We have the fact that in chapter 21, the Lord visited Sarah as he said. The Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of the son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. And then Abraham circumcised Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded. So, we see in verse 8, the child grew, was weaned. So, I don't know, year and a half, 2 years old-ish, 3 years old, maybe. I don't know how long they nursed in that time. There was a great feast on the same day that Isaac was weaned. And in verse 9, Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. Therefore she said to Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son. For the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac. And the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. But God said to Abraham, do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice. For in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman because he is your seed. So that covers the concept that God told Abraham at the very beginning that I will make you a father of many nations. Not just through Isaac, but now through Ishmael as well. And of course, even beyond that, we're going to see as well. But Abraham didn't really want to do it. Okay, whether or not, again, we don't know exactly what kind of relationship Abraham and Ishmael had, much less Abraham and Hagar. However, because of Sarah and her, in fact, it says in verse, Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. I don't know what that means. The son was scoffing. Whether that means he didn't like Isaac. I don't know. Maybe there's some sibling rivalry there, even though Isaac is only, maybe 2 or 3 years old. Regardless, Sarah was concerned about the potential of conflict or hostility between Ishmael and Isaac. And so Sarah, it would seem not necessarily out of jealousy anymore, but more out of protectiveness, I guess, motherly protection. She takes issue with Hagar and Ishmael being in the household now that they have Isaac. And so she wants to kick them out. And of course, God's going to take care of them. Abram gives them supplies and sends them out, and God takes care of the rest.
It looks like she was also worried about his inheritance or something.
Yeah, and that would seem to, the son will not be heir with my son. Yeah, that could be as well. Yep. Yeah, could be about the inheritance too.
This is also the same word, though, that's used. I mean, it's translated scoffing, but it's the same word as when Sarah and Abraham laughed when they were told that they were going to have a son in their old age. It's translated as playing sometimes, as laughing.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I didn't catch that.
Yeah, and as normal as it might have been at the time, I think we shouldn't assume that whatever they did was right. They abused and used this woman,
Yeah.
Hagar, and they, like you said, they tried to speed along God's process and take matters in their own hands. And God saves them. God takes care of her and He protects her and her son. But Abraham and Sarah really, they use this woman, I think.
Yeah, it could be. And, of course, we don't know how this woman came to their household. We don't know what the whole situation. It says she's a bondwoman, whether that's a bondwoman by slavery or bondwoman by indentured servitude or whatever it may be. But you're right. It would seem that this wasn't necessarily by choice. Okay, Sarah gave Abraham Hagar to bear children with, and it happened. Now, having said that, a lot of this, again, chapter 17 is when those full promises come in, and that link between those terms there, maybe scoffing, laughing in the sense of, you look at it that way. Verse 9, if it were translated laughing, you wouldn't necessarily think of anything hostile on part of Ishmael. It would just be the fact that I don't want Ishmael having fun and playing with my son and being heir with my son. So maybe it wasn't necessarily just... It could be a laugh of derision or a laugh of contempt. It could be.
Talks about that he persecuted him, so I think it's more than just a...
Yeah, that's true.
Let's have fun kind of thing.
Yeah, that's true. I forgot about, Galatians chapter 4, you're right. We talked about that. Yep. Yeah. Okay. Anything else through that? Yes, sir.
Not the purpose of this study, but tied in when, on Abraham's side, the chapter from now, we often think about him being tested, go take your son and sacrifice him. This is the second time he's losing his son,
Yeah.
a son, one at a time, or he thinks he's going to the second.
Yeah.
It just kind of adds another dimension to when God says, sacrifice Isaac. Well, I just went through
With Ishmael, yeah.
sending away this son that I didn't want to lose.
Right. Yeah. And as a father, as any parent, that would be difficult regardless of the hierarchy and the relationships as they existed. It's still your children, regardless. So, all right. So we talked about how that she dealt harshly with Hagar. Then we see in Genesis chapter 18 and verse 9, chapter 18 we commonly associate with their angels, but these men come to Abraham and they talk about some things, and of course there's the destruction of Sodom that's looming. Abraham ends up pleading for Sodom. If there's this many righteous people, will you spare it? Yes, I will. And ultimately, they can't be found after it whittled down, I think, to 10. And then, so in chapter 19 and 20, we have more events taking place. But what happens in chapter 18, and starting in verse 6, Abraham hurried to the tent. This is as these two, I think it's 2 men at this point. Yeah, three men, verse 2. 3 men have come, and of course we know they're angels. Abraham doesn't know that yet. So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, quickly, make ready 3 measures of fine meal, knead it and make cakes. Abraham ran to the herd, took a tender and good calf, gave it to the young man. He hastened to prepare it. And so how he makes this meal. Then in verse 9, they said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, here in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. Now in verse 10, Sarah was listening in the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, after I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? And the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I surely bear a child, since I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you, according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son. But notice verse 15, Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. And he said, no, but you did laugh. And then, of course, you have the men arise, they go towards Sodom, and then they end up, I think it's at that point just 2 men, end up in Sodom with Lot and his family and that whole situation. Now, what's interesting about this is, do you know what the name Isaac means? In Hebrew, it means laughter. Isaac means laughter. Now, I want you to consider what happens here in chapter 17. Verses 1 on through verse 8, God's giving the promises, and he's reiterating the promises from chapter 12, being more specific now. Verse 9, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you. Talks about circumcision. He institutes circumcision here. And then in verse 15, as for Sarah, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarah, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her and also give you a son by her. And I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples shall be from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. Well, Ishmael is my son. He can fulfill the promise that you're talking about. And God says, no, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. So in the same discussion that God is telling Abraham, you're going to have a son, Abraham laughs, and it says here in verse 17, whether he laughed out loud or not, God knew full well that it's a laugh of disbelief, okay? He doesn't think, how's this going to happen? Sarah's 90 years old. Of course, keep in mind that she was always barren, okay? But now she's 90 years old. Not only is she barren, but she's kind of double barren because she's past the age of bearing children. And Abraham is kind of, he doesn't, I say disbelief, but he's incredulous. He's incredulous at this. But it's interesting because God, this is when God says, here's what you're going to name him. You're going to name him Isaac. You're going to name him Laughter. I think that's really interesting, okay, for a couple of reasons. First of all, we know both Abraham and Sarah laugh about it, okay? In chapter 21, if we go forward to his birth, remember what Sarah says here in verse 6. Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me. She also said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? For I have borne him a son in his old age. Now, this is part of one of our questions on on the back page with the questions, but why do you think God named Isaac Isaac? Why do you think he named him Laughter? What characteristics might be involved in that?
The question God, is anything too hard for God?
Okay. And so every time that they talk to Isaac and they say, Isaac, come here, what do you think they'll be thinking about, first of all? Old age. God gave us a child despite the fact that Sarah was barren anyway, and then we were past the age of having children to start with, or Sarah was. So that's the first thing that's going to come to mind when they use the word Isaac or laughter in that proper sense. But also it makes you wonder if there isn't a little bit of sense of humor on God's end as well, in the sense of kind of this good-natured reminder. You laughed when you heard that I was going to give you a child. You both laughed when you heard I was going to give you a child. Well, I'm going to have you name your child Laughter because I think it's fitting. Okay, it just makes you wonder the thought process. First of all, that God had in choosing Isaac in that moment. Obviously, God, he already was going to name him Isaac anyway. He knew what was going to happen. But Isaac is the name. But then in the thoughts of Abraham and Sarah later, once they have the child and they think about the fact that they did laugh when God made this promise, and now here they have this child whose name is Laughter. It's very poetic, I guess you could say, how God did that and brought that about. I just think that's really interesting. Yes, sir.
I had a friend in high school that when I met him for the first time, he's 6'5", big guy. I said, "Who's that?" And they said, "That's Pee Wee." And it's one of those. I think about that every time I said that, the story, and I'm sure they were the same way.
Yeah.
Every time they saw him or the name came out, a picture went in their mind that they couldn't get away from.
Yeah.
How we laughed.
Yeah.
We all probably have some memory of something that really sticks with us, even if we see someone or something funny they did, some little special thing.
Mm-hmm.
And they were no different from us.
Yeah.
That we would say the same thing.
Yeah. And of course, and even more so in their time and in the Old Testament times, names had meaning. Okay, there were prophets who were instructed to name their children certain things specifically as condemnation towards Israel. Names had meaning, and sometimes their names changed to associate the meanings. And it's just interesting to me, the name that God chooses here is just, it's so fitting. Like you say, there's a picture that forms in your mind with that. Yeah. And of course, this isn't the last time one of the patriarchs' names will change. Who's the next one? Jacob to Israel. Yeah. All right. So we will stop there. We will pick up. We're about halfway through with Sarah. We'll pick up here next Wednesday night. Thank you, everybody.